Hi there, I'm Dr. Julie Kramer. I am so excited to invite today James Saper, a registered TCM practitioner up in Canada, Guelph, Canada. He is an amazing Radiant Shenti teacher. We've been working together for 5 years. And I asked James to talk with us today about menopause. And it is a topic that a lot of people have been asking me to really provide more information on from a Chinese medicine perspective. And James is the perfect person with whom to talk about this topic. He has a vibrant practice as a TCM practitioner. He also is a Qigong, Tai Chi teacher and master. And so I look so forward to this conversation with you, James. Um, can you first begin by telling us a little bit about your practice, your training? I think it helps people get to know you a little bit better, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to share some time with you.
Yeah.
Um, I guess I've been in practice for over 20 years now. I've been in this small town outside of Toronto, Guelph, Ontario, and I've been built my practice here over those 20 years. Before that, I was actually working in the nonprofit environmental end of things. So I was working on sort of local causes for environmental stuff, which I drifted into environment and health when I was doing that work. So it was like pesticides and health, those sorts of things. And at that time, I also ended up getting interested in herbology. Just the way the world works, there was a whole bunch of, in the nonprofit world, there was this huge shift, and so there's suddenly no funds available. And I was just at that point where I had a little bit of experience, but not enough to compete with everyone else who was established. And so I sort of got edged out of that field, for better or for worse. And so I had to look for a different type of work that fit with what I was interested in. And of course, my interests at that time were already shifting a little bit to how health and environment interact with each other. And there was this curiosity about herbs and what do they do? And I had my first bottle of echinacea when I had a cold, and it seemed to work, and all these sorts of things. And when you look at herbs, and you don't have to look very far before you come across Chinese herbs, and then from Chinese herbs to Chinese medicine and acupuncture and movement therapies like Tai Chi and Qigong. And I thought, okay, this is the thing I want to do. So I did my training, I did my training in British Columbia, still in Canada. From there came back to Guelph and started my practice. It's been a general practice, so I haven't specialized on this field or that field, though really the people, at least here, who come are people who tend to be women because they tend to take care of their health more, be more aware of their health. And also because it is a complementary medicine, it's not, in Canada, we have sort of basic health care that's all covered. But anything in addition to that is a private health care. And so it tends to be people who are a little older because they're the people who have the time and the money who can afford it. So most of my practice has been working with older women and the issues, a wide range of issues that they deal with.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, we're fortunate that you had the shift from the environment to health. And it's so interesting because that I had a very similar alignment, really looking at broader environmental pictures and then coming into the individual. So, and then also for me, looking at individuals as a teacher for many, many years and noticing that as environmental factors worsen, their psychological health worsened, their physical health. And so my students were getting progressively less well as their food worsened. So that's so interesting. I think that might be another conversation we should have at some point about health and the environment and really helping people be aware. My husband, for the very first time, even though I've talked about this with him for years, it took someone else telling him, it's like, oh, BPAs are really bad and they're causing problems last night. I'm like, what? Do you see all these metal water bottles we have? Do you see? I'm like, okay. I love you, but anyway, okay. So looking at this, your practice being mostly women, older women, really with the time and energy and resources to care for themselves, what have you developed as your overall view of the concept of menopause?
Yeah, that's a great question. This isn't actually my view. I came across this view from another practitioner who sort of described this is the big picture end of things. You know, a lot of the education around clinic work, Chinese medicine or not, is, someone comes in, they have a headache. You look at the features of the headache, you find out what points you use, and you treat the headache. And this was probably one of the first times where someone came to some sort of health-based complaint and said, well, let's take this one step back and look at the overall of how a person actually functions from the point of view of Chinese medicine. And it's like, we're talking about menopause. So we want to talk about, it's called the Chong Vessel. So we're getting into Chinese medicine, and so now we're going to
Please do. It's okay. And anybody that has questions, they can feel free to email me, message, chat, put a comment. And I think it's important. And if you could also use like the English term for any of the vessels or whatever, that can also be helpful.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that was, yeah, so he was discussing it as the Chong, which is a Chinese word. It translates sort of as, sometimes it's called a rushing vessel, or it doesn't translate very easily, but it means a place where there's all sorts of activity. Chong means a place where, like a busy thoroughfare in a city where all sorts of things are going on. And so he said there's this important vessel, and it's related in physiology and the function of people's day-to-day living, especially with regulating the menstrual cycle. They say this is the vessel that fills with blood before menopause and then empties with each cycle, right, with the period. And so it acts like a reservoir. It's a little bit different than the other channels, like the lung channel, the stomach channel, where things are moving around. And it's those ones, the function is to transport the qi and the blood. This is a reservoir. So I had a different teacher who said, oh, this is like a river system, and this is the underground recharge, the water that's held subsurface, right? And so there's water that moves through the rivers and streams and lakes, but then there's these points where the water drops below the surface and gets stored in these areas. So this thoroughfare vessel is one of these places. And there's a very interesting thing that happens when women get to a certain age. The body starts to shift because it wants to conserve its yin and nourishment principle. And so this channel, which normally moves downwards, right, starts to change and move upwards in its direction. Both, the only part that's can be problematic, symptomatic, is a point where it's switching between these two. So this is the state of perimenopause, is when this channel isn't quite sure about which direction it should be moving in. And sometimes it's moving down, sometimes it's moving up, right? And so when it has this sort of chaotic, they call it a chaotic quality, then you start to see symptoms. The body starts to respond. So this is the explanation around some of the things like the mood changes, the depression, the insomnia, all of these sorts of things. And of course, the hot flashes play into this as well. And so what the overall thing in terms of treatment is to help a person move through this transition and reestablish the new normal flow. And here's the part that original practitioner described it, the way that they described it, which was very important, which was the big picture. When you're younger, you're taking in your experiences, and it's essentially forming your personality, giving you a sense of who you are. And then when you reach a certain stage of life, then that process changes, right? And there's the experiences that you have that you want to share. and bring out. And so this is really the sort of big picture of what this stage of life is about. And he speculated that, in cultures where older women are given more voice and more value, then this transition is not as difficult, right? So, and of course, this is part of what Chinese medicine is really always about, is about looking at the connections between things, how things interrelate between our emotions and our body, between our mind and our physiology, between the weather and ourselves, or between the pressures that we face from society and how we live our lives. And so that's sort of I think, an important big part of the equation when we're looking at menopause and talking about menopause. It really has to do with this point in time where it's an opportunity to reflect on who a person is and what they bring to the world.
Oh my gosh, James, that is such an incredible way to explain both the psychological and physical experiences I think women go through in this time of chaos, in this resolution. I think back during my master's research, I actually did some research on menopause and did a history of how psychology treated it from the 1920s on. And oh my gosh, I remember vividly a case study of a woman who was institutionalized because when she had reached menopause, she's like, I need to do something more. I have so much to give. And she wanted to get a job. And they literally institutionalized her because they thought she was crazy. And so I think the pressures of society are definitely a factor. I think it's almost on the opposite end of the spectrum now for women in the West, at least from what I see when we look at the media, how you should look, what you should still be that juvenile. There's a great book by Robert Bly called The Sibling Society. He's a poet. And he talks about how people in the West have forgotten how to grow up. They've forgotten this phase of adulthood, of what the responsibility is. And then I especially love this idea of women in menopause giving back, right? We're not valued or seen as wise. And when I lived in China, in Shanghai, man, you did not ignore the elderly wise ladies. And even when I traveled in Japan and South Korea, I hadn't thought about that as a psychological variable for women. Like, why can't I knew physically what we were doing. I knew how we were denying our health, denying our, because we couldn't look a certain way, we just kind of gave up or whatever. But this idea of we have so much to give and not being able to do so, not being able to have those connections can deny us our physical health as well.
Yeah.
That's actually so profound. Amazing. So when we look at it, let's start with some of the physical though, and then we can get more to the psychological, even though that's, of course, with my background, psychology is resonating. But I think people really struggle. They want to feel better. And I know in Chinese medicine, we have to talk about you have to be healthy to feel better. The mind body are not separate. So feel free to bring that in as well. But, so let's take maybe what are some of the most common problems you've seen in the practice that women come to you for? And what are strategies they can do on their own first? And then how can acupuncture and herbal medicine, Chinese herbs in particular, I'd like to focus on that because I think that working with a practitioner can really, and then you can also focus if you've seen some non-Chinese medicine herbs help. So maybe what can they do on their own, whether acupressure, Qigong, diet, and then when should they seek a practitioner to help?
Yeah. Okay. I'll answer it by giving you a brief synopsis of a patient of mine that I had. This is many, many years ago. There was a woman who came in. I like to start with this one because it makes me look really good. She came in, she was in her early 50s, and of course, one of her primary concerns was symptoms around perimenopause, primarily hot flashes, but also insomnia. There was some anxiety as well, though there's, like any person's life is not so clear cut that it's just one thing. There's a history of addiction to tobacco and alcohol that was in the picture. There was all sorts of stresses from the family history and all sorts of things. And so, though one of the main things that she found most disruptive was, of course, the hot flashes and the sweating. And so we did acupuncture, and after, I think it was just 3 treatments, she came in after that and said, "Oh, that's fine. It's all gone." And I was like, "Oh my goodness, wow, that's amazing." There's there's the points to clear this, what's called deficiency, heat, and so on and so forth, add support to the person. And it was one of those moments, because it was fairly early in my career, where I realized, oh, this can really change people's lives quite dramatically. So in the space of about, less than a month, the person who was being plagued by hot flashes suddenly didn't have that as a concern anymore. I have to contrast that, though, with lots of other patients of mine with very similar situations, where what's more common actually is we do treatments, and within that same period of time, the hot flashes are much better, right? They're much more reduced, but they're still present. And I think one of the things that is different, makes that difference, is the first woman, I'll call her Barbara, just in case we keep on referring to her. She was no longer working, right? The other women, often they're at a point in their careers where they're working, and they also have a lot of responsibility, carrying a lot of responsibility. And so it's not so easy for them to make this transition, because their career is still part of this previous part of their lives, if that makes sense. And so, again, and what's interesting about this patient, Barbara, is that from that point, she started to practice Qigong. From that point, she went on a retreat to quit alcohol. From that point, I forget how many years after I first met her. Well, I'm going to say about 3. I should have reviewed the case beforehand, but in any case, she moved and changed where she lived. She moved out of town. And so coming back to this theme of reflecting on all the things that have happened to you, good and bad, that make you who you are, taking control of the future direction of where you want to go, and making those changes so that you become more and more of who you want to be. Really, I think that's the part that really caused the change for her, right? Caused the healing to happen. So I think that's an important thing. It's easy to get caught up in, oh, well, you use this point, kidney 3 or kidney 7, and that will, fix all sorts of things. And yes, it will help, but it has to be in context with the person. And the person has to be in context with where they are in this transition in their life.
I love that. So here we are talking about the body, and the mind is so essential. It's so essential. When you're looking, though, for example, I know, when we're talking about this chaotic shift period, a lot of the symptoms people will have, that people have talked to me about, they'll have bleeding that doesn't stop for a month, or they'll have heavy clotting, or physical symptoms that become very scary. I know my personal journey into Chinese medicine happened when I had some long-term bleeding. It was like a couple weeks. And my gynecologist, I'm just going to talk about this. We need to talk about this. My gynecologist said, let's microwave your uterus. And I was like, what are you talking about? My body is telling me something really important. I don't even microwave my food. Like, why would I microwave my body? And so I did research, and that's how I found Chinese medicine. And within 5 treatments, the bleeding stopped. I had a regular cycle for another couple years, and then I went in to menopause, right? I just had a nice nice cessation, definitely had hot flashes and, some of the thing, I never had insomnia or the psychological anxiety or other problems because I do have Qigong, I do have yoga, I have those things that balance me emotionally. Um, but how do you help people through those fears, right? How do you help them when the Western medicine model is getting them so anxious? You've got to start a hormone, you've got to do the pill, you've got to do all these things that can actually exacerbate that shift, that transition, that moving from that downward movement to the upward movement. How do we help with that?
I think one of the things is, and one of the things is that it's important to stay practical about things. Chinese medicine, for its the wording of things, especially when you translate it into English, sounds very fancy and esoteric, and I've come to realize that it actually is largely quite a practical approach to things, but just coming from a very different perspective. Right. The hard part is this shift in perspective from taking things and looking more and more narrow, which is often what specialists, that's their training. That's what they've been trained to do. They'll look at things in greater and greater detail, which means that you're isolating things and not taking care of looking at the broader picture. Whereas Chinese medicine is the complementary reverse. I'll phrase it that way. That it wants to see everything in context, and though that makes everything much more sort of complicated, you can see a bigger picture that way. And the practical end of it is to recognize that there are multiple ways forward. There are multiple options on ways you can do things. If you get too caught up in there must be one right and one wrong, it does add a lot of stress. And especially when there's concerns like heavy clotting or heavy periods, prolonged bleeding. These are things you want to address, right? And for different people, what's going to actually be the practical, reasonable, and effective way of getting those results will vary. Worrying about which one is correct is probably not going to make things any better. Which, I mean, part of that means combining conventional advice from conventional practitioners and complementary practitioners and trying to find your way through. I know this is often, Julie, this is often how our conversations go. You're trying to get me to say something practical, and I keep going back to these big picture things, but I will try and provide at least a few practical, concrete things as well.
That's totally fine. And I think, the one, from your experience though, using like the women that come in when they have these symptoms, you have different approaches, but have you found Chinese medicine and herbs to be effective when you're working with those women who have the heavy clotting, who have that? I mean, I just want people to understand there are tools out there that can help them work with this holistic view of their body in a way that does work for them. And yeah, I know some people, they will want the traditional Western medicine, and they get a lot of voice for that. And what I'd love to share today is when you do have people for whom Chinese medicine is all they need. It is effective. And have you had that experience or not? I mean, fair either way.
Yeah, for sure. Certainly the bulk of the people I see, and especially in Canada, how things work is by the time they come to see me, they've tried everything else, right? They've done all sorts of other things, and it's when those aren't actually aren't being effective enough that they come to see me. So very, very often, women are already on like hormone replacement, and so we're working with a lot of my experiences working alongside some of these other treatments that are going on. But I think an important thing in terms of, again, big picture is, prior to 1950, the medicine in China was Chinese medicine. It wasn't an alternative medicine. It was the medicine to address all of the health concerns across the spectrum, from newborn babies all the way through to old age, and all of the possible things that you could encounter. There's treatments and protocols and formulas and acupuncture points meant to address these things. And so it's more a question of what is going to work best as a person, as a woman works through this whole transition of who they are. And so it's interesting that the choices you make in terms of, do I see this practitioner or that practitioner? Do I adopt this way of thinking about the body or that way of thinking about the body? Suddenly becomes a bigger question, because it is part of this process of reflecting on what your experiences have been and what are your values now, and how do you want to take those values to express who you are moving forward.
Oh my gosh, I love that. So nurturing and supportive for women to be on their journey, to be able to figure out what matters to them and that they have a choice, right? One of the things I've always loved about Chinese medicine is what women are 100 times more difficult to treat than men. These views that we've had women's medicine for thousands of years. It's women weren't even looked at in research until about 20, 30 years ago in the West. All the studies were extrapolated from research on men to women's body in terms of heart health and all that kind of stuff. So it sounds like women can do some research. They can think about what's going to work for them. I have a good friend who's in her 40s right now, and she's always texting me and saying, "Oh, what do you think about this? It's a Western medicine thing her friends are freaking her out about, or what do you think about that?" And I said, you get to choose your healthcare model. Do you want to go with this Western approach? Do you want to do a more Chinese or Asian medicine approach? Because we do have a lot of Korean, Japanese, influenced by Chinese medicine. Mm-hmm. And she is in this struggle. She's 44. She's working through this. She's really thinking about these issues. We got through a big scare last summer. The doctors were freaking her out about her heart. She had heart palpitations, and I shared, hey, here's some simple things to think about. And she went through all the tests. She did all of that, and they didn't have any answers for her. And I was like, just stop caffeine. I'm like, just maybe as your body is shifting. I didn't have the language of chaos, though. This is new language for me going forward. I love this downward to upward shift. And she stopped caffeine, and her heart was fine. And so it's this. Again, I feel the struggle with her, yet exactly the language you're using is she needs to be empowered. She needs to realize she has options and how she can move forward, as all the women and, friends of women who might share this, really bring it full circle. So I love that.
Yeah, and I mean it's a good example that palpitations, when the channel starts to move upwards more, then it causes this sort of unsettled feeling around the heart. The movement of the qi is not settled. And then the heart isn't able to keep a regular, even rhythm. You add in, because of this, the body is prone to be, the phrase is like, it is prone to be rising up, to have things rise up. And of course, because of this deficiency heat that's in the body, this heat that's there because the yin of the body is not as full and as stable as it could be, the body is prone to being overheated. And so you add in something like caffeine, which has this highly moving quality to the channels. And of course, it's going to provoke this kind of thing. Depending on the person, it can be around palpitations, or depending on the person, it could be around racing thoughts that keep them up at night, so on and so forth. Alcohol tends to be quite heating. If your body's already prone to being overly hot, then it will aggravate the hot flashes. So getting rid of or avoiding and reducing caffeine, avoiding and reducing alcohol, and of course, smoking has a similar thing. It's interesting. It's actually an interesting effect, because it also releases constraint in the body by using the lungs, right? You take in the cigarette breath, and it makes the lungs work, and suddenly you feel so much more relaxed. But at the same time, it adds this extra heat to the lungs and consumes some of the lung yin, dries them out, right? And so again, this will make the symptoms of menopause worse. So you need, a person needs to find other ways to have the same stagnation releasing effect, relaxation effect of feeling of being unconstrained. That people nowadays, they're not sure, or they don't use these words, but alcohol, smoking, smoking of tobacco or cannabis, they have this effect of getting rid of this stagnation that's held in the body, right? That's why we use them. They also have these side effects as well, right? They're either drying out the lungs, or else, which is the cigarettes, or else they're heating up the liver, which is the alcohol, the caffeine, which consumes takes away the stability of the heart, right? And so to find other things like movement, like Qigong, like stretching, that allow the channels to open and relax and move and regulate themselves, has that complementary way of achieving the same results, but without those problems attached to them. More in keeping with where people in their health journey should be.
I love it. And awareness is the first step, right? Awareness of why might I like cigarettes and cannabis and alcohol and caffeine. And when I have anxiety or I have heart palpitations, it is what I'm taking into my body, what I'm eating. And why am I ingesting that? Because again, the stagnation, I'm trying to clear, I'm trying to open my body. James, both you and I, we have lots of videos. If you're watching this on YouTube, here, there, and there will be a link to James's videos. And then if you're on Radiant Shenti watching this, we have a lot from all of the teachers we have at Radiant Shenti to help clear. And meditation is another great way to do that. Reiki, there's yoga, so many tools that can help with this clearing of emotional and physical stagnation. I think that's really, really amazing. I just want to honor your time, James, and maybe have you, just any last thoughts about Barbara, or last thoughts about, how people can begin this journey and move forward in a way that honors them. And and then I'll have a few closing words, but I just want to draw on your expertise just for some overall advice, and maybe especially address fear. Fear, I find, is fear, frustration about this change in their body, these physical, psychological, emotional, spiritual changes. I know you talk a lot about that. So yeah, just some final thoughts on that.
Yes. I think part of it is this is part of that reflection, as in looking back on the experiences you've had, the things that have made you who you are. And that will naturally bring up different emotions. And some of them, the funny thing with Chinese medicine is they don't assign good or bad to the emotions. They just list them off, right? And they say, oh, well, any of them with too much happiness can be bad, so on and so forth. So it's all in context. And so to recognize that there are these experiences and the emotions that they bring up is part of this process of understanding what are the things that make you who you are, right? And it's from there, this is that change in the flow of that vessel, right? That thoroughfare vessel is having that clarity of, oh, these are the things that make me who I am. This is an understanding of that, and therefore this is what I can bring back out to the world. The challenging part is making that transition, coming to terms with those different emotions and how they have helped to shape you who you are, right? Those choices, those lifestyle choices that you've done, the ways you've lived your life up until now, so on and so forth, and the changes you want to make, is also part of this process. I'm going to add in something extra because I feel like I have to add in something practical. And it's around dietary choices. This is important in terms of being able to also have that help define who you are. But in terms of treating the symptoms around menopause, I actually recommend looking more at Chinese herbs through a practitioner over food choices. It's a little bit of it's against my nature to say that actually, but I think in this case it is. The whole, in addition to this idea around this important vessel and how it's moving direction, is this idea of the deficiency of yin, right? This is the nourishing, grounding substance in the body. And it is built up in part from our diet, but it's a part of the diet that Western medicine or Western diets have moved away from. It's all the sort of, it tends to be animal proteins is a big part of it. And not just general animal proteins, it's all the gross stuff that we don't like to eat. It's the organs, it's the chicken feet, and it's beef tendons. It's these sorts of things that are for Chinese medicine, the things that really nourish the yin, right? We're at a point in time where our food supply is one where some of those things are not so reliable to eat in terms of them supporting our health. So this is a bigger conversation in terms of how we ended up here as a society and having a food supply that actually is a threat to our health rather than supporting our health. But given that that's the state that we're in, food choices, find a diet that works for you. To address the symptoms around perimenopause, it is actually looking at things like goji berries is a very important Chinese herb. There's another one which is Chinese asparagus, which is also a very useful herb in terms of helping with this transition. But of course, it's in context with other herbs and with other things, and so that's why a practitioner can help weave this all together or help weave it together alongside you.
I love that. Yeah, absolutely. I will put a link for US practitioners. And if you have one, you can send me like a registry in Canada, and anybody who wants to also email or put a comment of registries in your home country. I think that would be really great. I also, think it might be beneficial to share your intake, James. That assessment that you have that people can maybe look at. James has a wonderful health assessment to see where you might have your dominant imbalances. And then he has lifestyle and dietary recommendations that you can apply, and it won't hurt, right? Like it might not be all that you need. You might still need to get more herbs and, have that more involved. But I think it's a great place to start, at least with an awareness of what might be going on in my body that's creating my symptoms, right? You said it's also very individual. So if you're okay with that, we can recommend that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. And it's sort of, it gives a general idea of what to expect if you were to see a Chinese medicine practitioner.
Love it.
And so you get a sense of what kind of questions a practitioner might ask and how does that information sort of weave itself together into some recommendations. It's not as precise or as accurate as actually seeing a practitioner. It has sort of this general overview approach, but still I think it's quite helpful.
And I think it begins that information, excuse me, people can have more information that, oh, I've never even thought about this, right? I've never had this way of thinking about what is, liver, Qi stagnation or liver invading spleen or whatever the situation might be. And it begins the language so they can have that dialogue. You watching this can have a dialogue with yourself about what does my health model look like? How do I see my future moving forward? So, well, James, as always, I've learned so much. I am inspired as always, and cannot thank you enough for sharing your wisdom and insights with everybody. So thank you once again.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. I think it's great that you're taking time to talk about this. It's not something that gets talked about enough. So I think it's really great that you're putting voice to this.
Thank you.